Today we turn to a discussion of independent sample analysis, a specific kind of t-test. We should imagine the t-test to be a way to look at the null hypothesis significant test, a way to examine Karl Popper's idea of falsifiability. That is, we should assume that there is no relationship between or among variables, and demonstrate to ourselves that it is only rigorously by accepting the alternative hypothesis. Therefore, a t-test, a measure of difference, is a way to ensure against type 1 and type 2 error. Type 1 error, of course, the mistaken rejection of the null hypothesis, a form of gullibility. And type 2 error is a mistaken failure to reject the null hypothesis, a form of blindness because the data, the alternative hypothesis, actually has been demonstrated to be provable. An independent sample test is a test procedure that compares means for two groups of cases. Ideally for this test, our subjects should be randomly assigned to two groups so that any difference in response is due to treatment and not to other factors. This, of course, is very difficult, if not impossible, in certain kinds of educational research, especially where we're investigating educational research within a specific institutional setting. In our particular case, we'll imagine that a set of graduate faculty has looked at a master's program in professional and technical communication and identified the independent variables of writing and editing, document design, rhetoric, problem solving, collaboration and teamwork, interpersonal communication, specialized expertise, and technology as measures or independent variables related to graduate student performance in technical communication. In the particular data set that we have, we're going to look at only two of these variables, writing and editing and document design. But as this independent sample t-test, we're going to look at two groups of data, one from a spring data set and one from a fall data set. If we turn to the variable view, for example, we'll see that this variable, writing and editing, is examining comparison between a spring semester, the earlier time, and a later time, the fall semester. So what we're trying to look at here is the performance of students in different semesters according to the variable of writing and editing. We're also going to be looking at the variable of document design, again from an earlier spring semester, and compare those scores to a fall semester. In an independent sample t-test, we must perform a grouping mechanism. So we have all the scores of the 67 students from the spring term, 1 through 67 here. And we've identified those according to a grouping variable as group 1. The more recent set of scores, again, another 67 students, but here beginning on line 68 and following that all the way down to the end of our sample here at 134, we've identified as the second group. We've performed another grouping function here with the scores from the spring students, 67 students identified with group 1, and moving down, the 67 students from the more recent semester, the fall, identified with group 2. Let's perform now that independent test. In SPSS, we'll go to Analyze, we'll compare means, and we'll select our independent sample t-test. We'll choose writing and editing as our test variable, and our grouping variable, 1 and 2, groups 1 and 2, we'll put here. And we'll define those groups as group 1, the first 67 students from the spring semester, and group 2, the more recent students from the fall semester. We'll hit continue here as well. Under options, you'll note that the default is exactly appropriate, the 95% confidence interval that we must hit in order to reject the null hypothesis and accept the alternate hypothesis that there may be a significant difference between these scores taken over two different semesters. We'll hit continue, and we'll hit OK. And we'll notice here that on our 67 students, we had in the earliest spring semester a mean of 7.07, but that the scores actually decreased and went down in the fall to 6.29. So there is a decrease in scores. The independent sample t-test will tell us if these scores are significant or if they are not. If we take a look here a little further down, we'll see that our significant difference is based on 132 degrees of freedom, and that the significance here has to be set at a t-value of, has found to be set at a t-value of 1.725. So we are trying to get at the idea in this first variable, in the variable of writing and editing, did we or did we not hit this t-statistic? Well, if we move to a test and a table of such statistics, and we look at the 0.05 confidence interval, two-tail, because we don't know which direction this is going to be indicated, and we look at the degrees of freedom, we find that indeed we would had to have hit a figure of 1.984 in order to meet or exceed the t-statistic. Yet, if we return to our output, we find indeed that we did not, and we find that our t-statistic has not met the critical decision-making point, and that indeed the significance between the two sets of scores is not significant for writing and editing. We'll return to this in a moment. If we turn to the second variable of document design, again, we'll go to Analyze, move down to Compare Means, choose our independent sample t-test, and let's reset this now, because now we're going to be looking for document design as our test variable. Our grouping variable, again, we've defined as Group 1 for the spring scores, Group 2 for the fall scores. Again, hit Continue. We'll find now that indeed the scores from the spring were 0.829 for document design, and that they decreased to 0.677. Now, the t-statistic in this case has been established, you'll see here, at 3.417 for 132 degrees of freedom. Again, if we look at our 132 degrees of freedom at the 0.5 interval, we find that it was, as we saw before, 1.984, because the same number of students are in both parts of the study, and we find that indeed we have met or exceeded that degree set by the t-test, and then indeed we do have a significant difference in these two scores. We can therefore come to these conclusions. Regarding the writing and editing variable, scores recorded during the spring at 7.07 were higher than those recorded during the present fall semester. We said that indeed there was a decrease to 6.29. An independent sample t-test showed that the two sets of scores, however, were not significantly different, because the t-statistic did not meet or exceed the critical decision-making point. Regarding our analysis of the document design variable, we note that the independent variable scores during the spring were higher than those recorded during the present fall semester. Again, we noticed a decrease. An independent sample t-test in this case showed, however, that the scores were significantly different, meeting and exceeding our 0.05 confidence interval and meeting and exceeding the t-test statistic as established by the table. Such measures allow us to compare the progress, improvement, lack of improvement, across semesters, in this particular case, of two groups of students. The independent sample t-test, therefore, allows us to compare means for two groups of independent cases.